He's saying traditions, structures of religious life and practice have to be meaningful in that they point to Jesus. And if you do them in ways that doesn't point at Jesus, you got to stop that. That actually makes a mess. That bursts the wineskin. That tears a hole. It's why we are not offering animal sacrifices today in our service, because those all pointed forward to the coming sacrifice, who is Jesus. They were beautiful till Jesus came. To do them now would be act like we're still waiting for a Messiah who will die. We're still waiting for an offering that can pay for sin. Just for an overview of where we've been and where we're going, this section looks a lot on the authority of Jesus and the call to discipleship. The phrase I've used for this whole section, chapters 8 through 11, is this. It's the faith of the lowly. We see this authoritative Jesus calling disciples, and he calls all the wrong people from all the wrong places. And he goes and hangs out with them. We'll see that today. But all throughout it, even though he's going to these places, he doesn't dilute his authority one bit. He is Jesus Christ, revealed as God in the flesh, coming to forgive sin. And been very blunt about that. And so we said this: biblical faith, what we see in this passage, submits itself to the authority of Jesus and rests in his compassion. These are the two streams through these 3 chapters that we keep seeing. Is on one side the awe and wonder at his power and authority, and at the same time we see him stooping to touch lepers, people who have been isolated, a lady with an issue of blood, and redeeming these people and bringing them in. And so we see this authority and this compassion. And so I think you need to hold these together. Don't dilute his authority. Don't think because he's compassionate you can do whatever you want. But in the same token, in your respect of his authority, what good news of the one you surrender yourself to is a compassionate and loving leader. So that's the picture overall. For today's passage, we're going to talk a lot about discipleship and get to one of the phrases is one of my favorites. Discipleship is messy. Everybody likes to talk about discipleship. When you get to doing it, and it gets in your house and on your feet and messes with your family, then the follow-through gets tricky. And what we're going to see in this passage in particular, Jesus is going to make some messes, and it's going to bother people. We're going to get 2 different groups that will come in and look at what Jesus is doing, and they'll have questions. And so Jesus goes to contemptuous places to save condemned people. If you can go stand next to somebody who's condemned, you're going to look shady sometimes. Because if they actually need saving, they look shady. So we're going to see Jesus go those places, do those things, and not back down one bit on it. And he takes his disciples with him, and he makes them look bad too. That's the messiness of it, all right? So let's jump in. Just a reminder, I'm going to give you just 2 slides quick for where we've been, where we're going. Matthew as a whole, we've said, is broken down into essentially 5 books with a prologue and an epilogue. The structure that shows you those breakdowns is there's a flow where there'll be some narrative. Jesus goes here, does this, does this, does this, and then there'll be a block of teaching. It was really obvious in the first book. We had his growing up and his calling of his disciples, and we had the Sermon on the Mount. Now in this one, we've got him running around doing miracles and a couple little comments in between as he calls disciples, and then he'll stop and take all of his disciples in chapter 10 and send them out, and it will have a whole chapter of him preaching again. So we've already covered book 1. We're in what we call book 2, which is 8, 9, and 10. As I already alluded to, 8 and 9 would be the narrative part of that, and chapter 10 is him sending them out. The overarching theme is authority. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, it said they marveled that he taught not like the scribes, but as one who had authority. And so we've got our 3 chapters. I'm not going to dwell on that too much. The authority came back up after he calls or invites at least a couple disciples. He calms the winds and the storm, and they marvel that he has authority over the waves and the sea. So 8 and 9 break up into 7 itty-bitty chunks, if you will, little stories or teachings. We have gone through all of 8 and the first little chunk of 9. So here's what we've done. We saw a bunch of miracles in chapter 8, notably to all people you shouldn't touch or minister to, Gentiles, lepers, and women. And in their day, all of that was a problem. We got this picture of faith and authority then, where he calls some disciples, tells them to leave stuff behind. And then he hops on a boat, calms the sea, and we see his authority over demons and sin. And one of the points we made at that point, and I'll keep hammering this, is Jesus is getting very explicit that he is not only a Messiah, a great prophet or a teacher, but that he is God. He has the authority over all of creation. He has authority over all spiritual beings and powers, but most explicitly, he has authority to forgive sin. And that only works if he's God, because sin is against God, so only God can forgive it. If anybody else is forgiving sin, they're lying. And so the scribes and the Pharisees see him say, I can forgive sin, and they say blasphemy. They don't say deluded, crazy, or stupid. They say blasphemy because they understand only God forgives sin. And he says, yeah, and I want you to get that's what I can do. So I can forgive sin. Get up and walk. He's vindicating and proving to them his divinity. This is why he's authoritative. We don't serve some guy. In choosing to follow Jesus, we have submitted ourselves to God. And so that was the setup that then brings us into 9, 9, and forward. We'll look at these next two chunks where Jesus calls Matthew. This is a cool part because this is Matthew's gospel. Finally, the author shows up. And so we'll get the calling of Matthew in verses 9 through 13. And that will raise some questions from the scribes and Pharisees. And then the way Matthew tells the story, kind of right in the same vein, John's disciples show up and they got questions too. And so we get basically questions about what on earth is Jesus doing. Let's go ahead and read the passage. I want to work through it, but let's get the text in front of you. So Matthew 9, verse 9. And I'm reading from the ESV, and this one I didn't see a lot of translation issues, so if you see something weird in your passage, grab me afterwards, we can talk. As Jesus passed from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, follow me. And he rose and followed him. And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? But when he heard it, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The day will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved. So here we have Jesus answers as people react to his ministry. And we've got two different groups reacting. We got the Pharisees who are used to seeing pick on Jesus, but now we even got John's disciples showing up, which some of Jesus' disciples are former disciples of John. They're like, we're with John, see him baptized, go follow Jesus. So this is kind of a team we like, and they're also like, what on earth is Jesus doing? So everybody's confused watching Jesus do ministry. I wasn't using my notes at all, so let me just bounce a couple in here. So we're going to look at this. My primary thing, I'll hit some side roads, but is to see Jesus' answers as he explains the messiness or defends the rightness of his ministry in light of people who are kind of confused and maybe a little disappointed. So let's take the first chunk. Jesus calls Matthew. Now, there's some fun stuff here. If you remember, the last time we really had an explicit calling, we had earlier in chapter 8 some guys that say they want to follow, and Jesus challenges them with sacrifice, and then we don't know if they follow. It just says he gets on the boat and his disciples follow him. All we know is if they agreed to sacrifice, they became disciples, and we don't know if they did. So the last clear we actually picked up some disciples was clear back in chapter 4 when he calls the fishermen, right? Comes out, and they leave their boats, leave their nets, leave their dad, and jump out and follow him. There's sort of some irony here, because we talked then about the fact that these were not likely people you would call. Fishermen are not, school graduates, not highly literate. These would probably be Jewish guys who went to Torah school, didn't do well, so they didn't get to stay. They went and got real jobs. And that's who Jesus goes. Normally, rabbis go to the synagogue and pick up the ones who are still there. And so he goes for the dropouts. And so he's thinking that would challenge people, and it kind of proves discipleship is for whoever. But now he stoops lower because this guy is who the fishermen don't want. A number of commentaries make the point. He's at a tax booth. That's bad enough. Just being a tax collector is a bad day because put yourself in their shoes, right? They are an occupied country. A foreign power has come in, taken over your country, and is now extorting fees and tributes from you. And some of your own people have decided to go work for that other power to take money from their brothers. That's Matthew. So in general, nobody likes tax collectors. It's why even in this passage, he'll say he hung out with tax collectors and sinners. I want you to get this in your head. When they say sinners, it's because they're referring to sins so bad they don't want to name. It usually refers to prostitutes and heinous criminals. But tax collectors don't even deserve to be put in that group. There's sinners. Don't say their word. And then there's tax collectors. I'll name that one. That's bad. But remember where we are, right? He crossed over on one side of the sea, had the whole demon pig episode, crossed back over the other side of the sea. We've left Jesus at the shore. The setting here is coastal, and most of the commentaries agree. Matthew is probably at the tax booth at the docks, getting fees from fishermen. How do you think these fishermen feel when Jesus is like, oh, it's a boat? And they're like, that guy. And he's like, yeah, come follow me. This is literally the kind of tax collector that annoys them personally most. They have probably struggled with trying to escape paying fees from guys like Matthew, or maybe even literally Matthew. They may have been extorted by Matthew, or people, at least people like Matthew in his very same booth. They were fine with grace coming to fishermen, but are they okay with grace coming to Matthew? That's the dilemma of this passage. That's been an ongoing theme, but it's climaxing here in our passage. Jesus is going to call the people that just know you went too far, not him. I don't mind if you get some people with rough edges, but not him. And that's exactly who Jesus calls. And so it affirms some of these core discipleship principles that I will hammer on till I'm blue in the face. One, we've said our main discipleship principle is that disciples are called to become more than they are now. He did not call Matthew because Matthew was awesome. Matthew was awesome to nobody. I don't even think the Romans would have viewed him as anything more than a traitor they could pay off. So scum to everybody. So we talk about discipleship. My struggle is, oftentimes in my experience, we treat discipleship like elite Christianity. You know, the gospel goes to everybody. There's regular Christians, and then there are the disciples. I'm part of a discipleship organization, which makes me like the suit and tie of the Christian group. And that just doesn't match what we see Jesus doing. He's calling the guys who wouldn't know how to tie the tie. It's not earned, but it's offered by grace. Discipleship is not, you're called if you're good enough. No, you're called because you're not good enough. And he's going to make you into something you've never been. Yes, they will be transformed. Yes, at the other end of this gospel, they will be sent out as apostles and church planters who take the gospel to the ends of the earth. But today, they're tax collectors and stinky fishermen. And the qualification is not their character, their intellect, their social standing. The passage doesn't take any time to say anything good about Matthew. Just that he's at a tax collector's booth. And Jesus calls him. So, it is not about who you are, it's who Jesus wants to make you into and whether you're willing to follow him. And so it's offered by grace. And the irony here is Matthew will leave the booth and go follow Jesus. It's the scribes and the Pharisees who are like, what are you doing? Why are you hanging with those people? We can't go there. Oftentimes the folks who will struggle most with being discipled are the people who have a confidence in their own righteousness. I have literally, just even in the last 2 months, sat with folks and said, yeah, I see some guys, I want to invite them into discipleship. They don't want to be discipled. They don't feel like I have anything to offer them. If you think you've got something, you won't let someone else invest in you. Now, I have told you guys story after story of how God has used people younger than me, more immature than me, to invest in me because the Holy Spirit works through God's people to build us up. It's a grace thing. And when you know that you're nothing, you're open to God using people in your life. And as soon as you think you've got some stuff, you get a title like pastor, well, who can disciple me? Some of you guys have listened to, I've been enjoying the podcast Christianity Today put out called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. It's a story of Mark Driscoll and a church plant out in Oregon. And one of the things that happens, you had a young church planter who is not willing to be discipled. And they talked about staff members coming to him and saying, like, Mark, you got to get somebody to invest in you. And he would say, well, who could invest in me? And he's plugged into the Gospel Coalition. He's going to conferences. At one point they said, well, why not somebody like John Piper? Get one of these older ministers who's willing. And he says, John Piper can't disciple me. He can't mentor me because I have a bigger church than him. This man crashed and burned his church and left a crater of a testimony. If you think God doesn't have somebody who can invest in you, you're wrong. You might not see who they are. You might not like who they are. But his Holy Spirit is sufficient, and he builds people up through his body. He gives gifts to build up the body. I think we got to come through this grace door and say, I'm willing to humble myself and be a Matthew who, when Jesus says, come, I just come. And I'm going to trust that if God has a structure he wants to use, he can work in and through it, and he can use messed up people. That's the heart of this. So it comes by grace, and it calls us as we are, but it calls us to become something more. The other point here, sacrificial commitment is the initial and constant requirement for discipleship. We've seen that every time. The cost isn't identical. Matthew doesn't have to leave fishing nets behind. But he does leave a tax collecting booth behind. And he's literally at work at the booth. I don't know what the repercussions are of walking out on that booth. I don't know how Rome looks at that. The tightwad in me wonders how much money was still on the table when he walked off. Matthew just hears the call and walks. For each of them, there was a sacrifice. Some it messed with their jobs, some it messed with their families, some it messed with their comforts, some it messed with their culture. Because the point isn't you have to give enough to make God happy. This isn't that we've now shifted to works and earning. The point is faith is allegiance. I surrender myself to God. Whatever surrender needs to look like in my context is faith. The actual thing I give is just evidentiary. It doesn't earn anything. The heart of surrender makes me a disciple. What was surrendered is just stuff. God's not sitting there with a scale going, well, one tax collector booth, all right, Matthew, you're in. If there wasn't a booth, though, you'd be on probation. You didn't earn anything. It's just that the way you become a disciple is through sacrificial commitment. It costs you in commitment. And so this question of, you really want to believe in Jesus? Talk is cheap. Lots of people like Jesus' teaching. Very few of them leave booths behind and follow. There's two other principles I didn't make slides from because we'll hit them in future sermons. They're here in the background, and they'll come to the foreground by chapter 10. And so I'm just going to hit them quick to get you ready for them as you read in Matthew. One, we would say that discipleship happens in a family-like environment, which includes defending the people inside of it. We see this here because we get these questions from two different groups, both the scribes and the Pharisees. They come in this first story and say to the disciples, why does your master eat with these people? But the disciples don't have to answer. Jesus speaks up and defends them. Later we have the disciples of John coming up, and they're looking at Jesus' disciples. Why don't they fast? And again, Jesus speaks up. They're growing by walking alongside him and learning. They don't actually understand everything they're doing yet, and that's okay. When you're being discipled, there's a duty of a discipler to do some protecting. And so we'll unpack that because he'll get more explicit and he'll get more blunt in a couple chapters. The other thing is that we would say discipleship happens through hands-on. Discipleship is hands-on. It's not all talk. And you see that here because the disciples aren't hearing lectures about going and being willing to sit with sinners. They're at a party with sinners and tax collectors. Like Jesus takes them in there. I wonder what that's like for a bunch of little Jewish boys walking to this party where like mom would die if she knew I was here. And Jesus doesn't talk about it. He takes them there. Likewise, They understand the Jewish systems of when to fast and when not to. Some of them have been disciples of John and probably been participating in the fasting that at least John's disciples do. And Jesus has ushered them into a different lifestyle, and they're not fasting. They're experiencing the teaching of Jesus, hands-on. So both those will be principles we'll unpack later. I just want them in your vision. The big thing here is we definitely see the sacrifice and the grace. That's, I think, the heart of the sinners and tax collectors get to be called in. So the first group, the grace of God comes, and Jesus affirms, even quoting Scripture, we come for the sinner. Discipleship is for the sinner. The gospel is for the sinner. There's nobody we're going to go, ooh, not them. We want them in, and we want to hang out with them. And what I see here as far as the discipleship's messiness is when, there we go, that's an extra slide. When Jesus hangs out with them, it looks bad. Jesus is traveling. There's a whole big debate on what house is he in, but it's probably Matthew's house. And it's interesting that Matthew's the vaguest. It says he was in the house, but some of the other Gospels say it's his. Matthew, this is his people. He's a reject. All he can do is hang out with rejects. Like I mentioned before, the idiomatic expression sinners probably refers to prostitutes or criminals whose crimes are particularly repulsive that you don't want to say what it was, which is mostly prostitutes. This is who's gathering. Matthew throws a party, and I think this is what we see with the gospel often. When you reach somebody, you reach a whole community. And so Jesus reaches Matthew, and Matthew's community shows up. And they all gather, which should be, from a gospel point of view, exciting. The gospel is going to a whole, not just got to Matthew, right? But it's getting the tax collector team. But when he goes there, people are like, what is he doing over there? These kinds of gatherings and parties are where normally people get drunk. And when you have a party and you bring prostitutes, that's a certain kind of party that's not a good one. And so, I mean, I understand the Pharisees, whoa, Messiah can forgive sin, and then goes to that party. And Jesus doesn't say, my bad. Hey guys, let's find another venue. He's willing to be misunderstood. He says, yeah, this is where I belong. I'll explain it and tell you. I don't think they get it. But when we talk about discipleship as messy, it gets you messy because you go to messy places. If you're going to actually go reach people, you're going to sit in a situation where it's like, whoa, what on earth are they doing? And who is that? And if you've ever been in that spot where you realize you are in over your head, that's where you belong. And I'm trying to understand this idea that he could come and be in a house together, that the doors get open and they come in. Discipleship's messy. We don't get to avoid the appearance of evil. And this is a big one. Scripture does not say to avoid the appearance of evil. Unless you use the KJV, you've got a verse in Thessalonians, and nobody else renders it that way because it's not a great way to read the Greek. And it wouldn't make sense to read it that way because Jesus didn't avoid the appearance of evil. In the subsequent chapters, like really soon, you'll hear the scribes and Pharisees accuse him of getting drunk. They think he's a wine bibbler. Why? Because he goes to this party and parties like it. So we don't get to avoid the appearance of evil, we avoid evil. We need to be where sinners are, which means we're going to be near where sinners are sinning. We just don't sin with them. A lot of times we're like, I'm willing to reach sinners, I'll go where sinners are, but I can't be around that. I remember the first time I worked a regular kind of secular job, and the coworkers spoke like coworkers, right? They have a vocabulary I didn't grow up with. And then at some point they found out I was a Christian, and they all started apologizing, and I was like, this is how y'all talk. I don't talk that way because I love Jesus. You don't know Jesus, so why would you talk differently? It doesn't hurt me to be around cuss words. They don't get into my soul. Jesus has my soul, and he's sufficient. And when I can be there and be around them, not joining them in their sinning, I get to enter into some conversations I never got to have before, where I got to share the gospel to folks who had never heard it. I was amazed. In our county, with churches on every block. We have people who literally didn't know Jesus rose from the dead. They thought we were just morbidly obsessed with a dead guy and hanging crosses everywhere. We didn't know that, like, no, you don't understand, like, we hang empty crosses because he didn't stay dead. It's a big deal. You didn't know. Because we stay in our different little groups. We go to our Christian establishments with our Christian friends and our Christian music, and if you don't measure up to our Christian standard and act Christian, you can't be with us. And I don't see Jesus rolling that way. I see him going to the nasty place that we don't go and hanging with the nasty people that we don't hang with, that they may be one. So we need to be willing to be where sinners are, which means you're going to have to get dirty by being near where sinners are sinning. But don't hear me one bit saying that means we sin to look cool. It's you actually being profoundly different by the power of the Holy Spirit in those places that breaks the domain of Satan and introduces the authority of the gospel. That's the messiness of the disciple. We're going to go places. And Jesus goes there. And Matthew's story is that kind of a story. So that's the first calling. That's the scribes and Pharisees hang up. They don't want to go where the sinners are. The other groups, John's disciples don't seem to mind the party. They didn't say, why are you there? Maybe hanging out with John made that look fine. But they show up and say, why don't you fast? And it's really interesting because they actually sort of take the Pharisees' side on this one. They said, we and the Pharisees fast. But you don't. Your disciples don't. So here they're concerned because they have traditions and rituals, a way of doing religious life, and Jesus is not doing it. And then he gives an answer and two parables in reply. He says, well, can wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? Like, fasting makes sense at certain times, but do you know where we are? That's his answer. And that's actually the meaning you need to read his two parables with. When he talks about wineskins and wine, and when he talks about new cloth and old cloth. Sometimes these get twisted to just be about, like, accommodating the culture, right? New wineskins means we sing contemporary music, we have a drum set. No drum sets were referenced in this passage. Yes, it is about our religious traditions and culture, but the point Jesus was making was this. Those things are appropriate when they point to Christ. And anytime they obscure Christ, they're inappropriate. The problem with fasting when Jesus there was fasting was a way of showing repentance and showing anticipation. Often you fast on the eve of a feast. So like in the lead up to Passover, you might fast. And then when the lamb is provided and it's sacrificed, you cook that meat and you break the fast and you eat. The example he gives is when the bridegroom's there, we don't fast, we have a party. Now, this is big because God has referred to himself as the bridegroom of his people all across the Old Testament. Jesus is saying, I'm the bridegroom, and I'm here. The fast is over, the feast has begun. And so it's not that fasting is bad, but fasting doesn't make sense when Jesus is here. He's saying traditions, structures of religious life and practice have to be meaningful in that they point to Jesus. And if you do them in ways that doesn't point at Jesus, you got to stop that. That actually makes a mess. That bursts the wineskin. That tears a hole. It's why we are not offering animal sacrifices today in our service, because those all pointed forward to the coming sacrifice, who is Jesus. They were beautiful till Jesus came. To do them now would be act like we're still waiting for a Messiah who will die. We're still waiting for an offering that can pay for sin. And so while they were great in their place when they pointed to Jesus, to do them now would obscure him, would tear our gospel to pieces, would rupture our witness in the community. We would look like a people who don't have a Messiah. So instead we take communion and we look backwards and we remember. Do we have traditions and practices? Yes. But we evaluate them about whether they are appropriately responding to Jesus. And so this is his point. The issue with John's disciples isn't that they're afraid of hanging out with sinners. They just don't know what time it is. Their calendar's messed up. John was preparing the way for Jesus. Jesus has come and they're still on preparation page. And he's like, update your schedules, guys. The bridegroom's here. What's interesting is this means John's disciples don't understand Jesus. They're struggling and judging what he's doing because they don't understand it. And he doesn't say, my bad, I'll fast to make you feel better. He just explains and continues doing what's right. And this is the thing that you're going to hit. We want to follow Jesus. We honor Jesus, and we go where Jesus sends us. And we don't judge that. That's why I don't think you want to avoid the appearance of evil. You don't do it to make other people happy. Avoiding the appearance of evil, appearance to who? How many audiences must I satisfy? Because there's always somebody who doesn't like something. And if the right thing is confusing because it's countercultural, do we not do it till we've properly educated the culture? When do you saturate a town or community or church enough? Especially since new people move in, other people move away, and people are born, people die. You have to be willing to say whether people understand it or not, whether it looks good or not. I follow Jesus. And I go where he sends me, and I obey him as my king. And right here, Jesus and his disciples are not exempt of being judged, looked down on, and misunderstood. If you want to follow Jesus, you will have the same. If you're going to hold out till Jesus makes the most sense, makes everyone happy, you will never follow Jesus. This is the messiness. Jesus chooses that mess and walks into it. Jesus will make that mess in your life. And then the reminder for us as a church is already hit on. The tradition of fasting wasn't bad. Jesus doesn't say that the Old Testament was bad. He says in the Sermon on the Mount, I didn't come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill it. Our worship has been transformed in light of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Not in abandonment of the Old Testament, but in the fulfillment of it. And so when I say tradition, I mean any religious practice we have, however you grew up, you like pews, you like chairs, you like sanctuaries, you like gyms, you like contemporary, you like hymns. Now contemporary is stratified into two different categories because Michael W. Smith is now old contemporary and Hillsong's new. And whatever you grew up in, that's your tradition. Whether you call it a tradition or not, that's your tradition. And our loyalty is not to our traditions, our loyalty is to Jesus. And we evaluate these things whether they appropriately reveal Jesus. Tradition must be Christ-centered or it will be Christ-obscuring. Fasting wasn't bad. But their allegiance to fasting is what's making John's disciples not recognize Jesus. People who picked the right prophet, listened to the right teaching. These aren't the Pharisees. They're John's team. And they're still going to keep struggling with, is he the one? Is he really the one? Why don't you fast? They're so immersed in their traditions, not seeing the traditions as a means to meeting and knowing Christ, but as an end in and of themselves, that the traditions now are blinding them to Christ in their midst. So the point here isn't the traditions are bad. Jesus even says, yes, we will fast at some point. You don't say, okay, well, if hymns obscure Christ, then we're done with hymns. It's like, no, fix your heart and the hymns won't matter. If they understood me correctly, they'd know when to fast and they know when not to. So that's why I say this isn't a defense of whether we do the new or the old. It's about the heart that makes both good. We want traditions that come from a heart that wants to see Jesus and worship him. And as somebody who has worshiped with churches literally all over the globe, I can worship in a lot of different worship styles. If the heart is to magnify Jesus and is centered on him, that's worship, and I'm in. With drums. In Nepal, they've got their own idea of harmony that isn't Western. It doesn't sound good to my ear, but Jesus is exalted, and I can worship with those people. And then I sing, and they probably think the same thing about me, and they can worship with me. It must be Christ-centered. My heart for you is not that you just love the traditions that we do or don't do in Christ's house. My heart is that you engage us looking for Jesus. So we get these two sides looking in, and both of them are wrestling because they're missing the point of who Jesus is and what Jesus came to do. And in the authority of Jesus, Jesus is going to do what his Father sent him to do anyway. And he invites his disciples to join him in that mess. And as they do, they get transformed into his likeness. So this is just where I want to leave us. We see the call of Jesus going to a Matthew, willing to go into that kind of place and taking his disciples with him. That's our invitation. To be the kind of fisherman who will follow Jesus to a tax collector's house. Maybe even the same one that robbed your family. Discipleship is messy. Jesus goes to contemptuous places to save condemned people. So the questions are going to be real simple this week. It just comes down to, are we going to be this kind of people? It's not just, are we going to be this kind of church? Because this is actually, you're sent out to be that people out there, right? I've told you guys 100 times, you are our altar call. We don't save them in here. You go witness to them out there. So are you ready to be that kind of people? That kind of homes? Can Jesus have a party at your house with the kind of guests he wants to bring? I put that down there because that was the one that zinged me. I have a daughter, and I have a house that's never ready enough. I have 100 excuses why I can't open it, can't host. My standard of too messy doesn't match Jesus's. Jesus would totally have a party in my house if I would let him. Can Jesus have a party at your house? And then the other question would be, who are those guests today? Who are the, it's easy to say tax collectors and sinners. We're still not a big fan of tax collectors, but it's not quite the same level. Who are those people that have offended your values or wronged your team that you would be uncomfortable being around them? I think we have our own categories. There are some overlaps. People who have done criminal type of activity we get nervous about. People who have done sins that we view as marks, the prostitutes, we would still struggle with. Generally, people who we feel like there is immorality in their life, we struggle with. Can the immoral person come and sit with you to hear about Jesus? So I want you to think about who those guests are. Here's the questions, though, as I'm going to put them to you for your groups. I'm going to send you out into groups now. When does fear of what others think or will think make it hard for you to obey Jesus? We've got two groups picking on Jesus and the disciples, but they went anyway. So what are those fears that would have kept you from going with Jesus into that room? 2, how can our group go to the lost in our community? And then, as always, that's like 3 questions bundled into one, because who are the lost in our community and where are they? You have to answer how you get there. But that should give you more than enough. In fact, my hope is it gives you too much to talk about today, so you'll come back and join one of our groups during the week to finish the conversation.